And welcome back. 12 years ago, one of the finest fire service museums in the world opened at the McDonald Road fire station in Edinburgh. It's called the Braidwood and Rushbrook Museum after two distinguished city firemasters. This week, the museum is reopening after a refurbishment, and so we thought we'd send John Toy and Michael Mulford along to have a look at all their and our yesterdays.
Well, hello, and welcome to the McDonald Road Fire Station, just to the east of the centre of Edinburgh, and the proud home of the Braidwood and Rushbrook Museum, which is where we're going to be visiting tonight to find out something about the proud heritage of Scotland's fire service. Now, this expanded dinky toy I've been riding in here, courtesy of the firemen, is only costing a paltry £37,000, a little bit more than the appliance with which Michael Mulford's mixed up with. Michael?
The firemen were bold and high expansion foam had not been invented. They used to put out fires with horse dung. Not as daft as it sounds, actually, because horse dung contains water and it contains ammonia. Well, this particular appliance dates back to 1824, which was the formation of the world's very first municipal fire brigade here in Edinburgh. We'll be hearing more of the story of James Braidwood, the first firemaster. But for the moment, let's meet the curator of this museum, Assistant Firemaster Ian McMurtry. Ian, hello.
How you do?
Now, a museum like this must collect bits and pieces from a lot of places. What sort of places?
Well, all over the world, really. We've tried not to be provincial in any way. We try to get anyone that will give us stuff we'll accept.
Yes, and why really a museum? Why do you want to keep all these bits and pieces going?
Well, we have a great tradition. We are the first municipal fire brigade in Britain, if not in the world, and obviously we have the equipment dating back to that day, so we want to try and build on that.
Some of these guys a moment ago were shouting for beer, beer. Now, why is that?
Oh, well, yes. Obviously, there weren't enough firemen to operate these pumps, so what they did was invited members of the public to give them a hand on the arms. All the time they pumped, they were entitled to beer, which was on a hogshead on the top. If it was running low, the traditional shout of beero was set up and more beer was supplied.
And they really had to stand like this for perhaps hours on end?
Yes, of course, they didn't have to stay the whole time, but as well as the beer, they got a token which they presented to the police next day, and they got money for it as well.
And this particular red hat that I'm wearing, that's got a significance as well,
yes,
the colour.
Well, that goes with this engine. There was 4 engines in Edinburgh, north, south, east and west, and each engine was painted a distinctive colour, and the helmets were the same. There was red, grey, blue and yellow. And the engines, of course, were exactly the same.
On the 21st of April, 1703, Douce city fathers of Edinburgh, alarmed by what can only be called a series of calamitous conflagrations, set down an act to appoint a company for quenching fires, and also rules to be observed by the inhabitants thereanent. And thus started an entirely new era.
Very quietly. That's right, John. In fact, it takes us into the era of these. Ian, these are what?
Insurance fire marks placed on buildings by the insurance company to whom the people subscribed. That one's made of tin. They were originally made of lead, as the sun one shows, but the lead and brass became too expensive a metal. They were being stolen all the time, melted down for scrap, so they turned to tin eventually.
And the fact of the matter was that when the fire brigade turned out, what happened when they came up to a house with a mark on it?
Well, in the early days, an insurance company had their own fire engine. If they came up and it happened to be the union, they would start fighting the fire right away. If it wasn't the union, they would stand by. If it happened to spread into a house next door, which was covered by their insurance company, they would start then to fight the fire. But meantime, if the union had come along, there was a fight about the water supply.
So you had firemen fighting
with firemen.
Fighting
yes,
with firemen about that. That's
yes.
incredible. So the insurance companies came and went eventually, and as we know that in 1824, James Braidwood here became the first fire master, or master of fire engines, was it in those days?
Master of engines, yes.
I mean, his contribution to the history of the fire service is tremendous, isn't it?
Oh, it is. He was the first fire master, officially appointed fire master for the municipal fire brigade in Edinburgh, and from there he made such a good job that he went on to London.
Let's stay in Edinburgh for a moment, because he was he had a certain philosophy about firefighting which still applies today now, doesn't it?
Well, he was a great believer that you couldn't fight fires from outside the building. You had to go inside, find out where the fire was, extinguish it, use as little water as possible and cause as little damage as possible.
And that's still something which holds
Very much
today.
so,
He
yes.
was also a very meticulous man in his logbook, which we've got down here as
Oh,
well.
yes, uh-huh.
I think it's what, December the 24th, Christmas Eve 1828, and Edinburgh was caught up with Burke and Hare on trial. Now, James Braidwood had something in mind for that night.
Oh,
didn't
well, he thought there might be rioting when Burke and Hare were being tried, and he made his men at the headquarters station in High Street, Edinburgh. He had 7 men on duty there and others in the area where Dr. Knox lived.
That's right. It was Burke and Helen McDougall, his common-law wife, who were on trial, and
That's correct.
it's a lovely old story. But Braidwood then went to London, and he made a tremendous impact there as well,
Yes,
didn't he?
he was invited by the commissioners in London to take charge of the London Fire Brigade. He moved there on the 1st of January 1833, and a very important day for a Scotsman, I would think, you know.
Absolutely. And he was only 20 odd at that time.
He was
wasn't
under 20 when he took charge of the Edinburgh Fire
It's
Brigade.
marvellous. In fact, sad to say that he, in fact, died, and this is a wonderful picture of his funeral. Now, if you had a funeral like that, I'm sure it would mean something, wouldn't it?
Well, in these days, it's the second largest funeral in London that London had seen. The largest was the Duke of Wellington, so it shows you the esteem he was held in when he came second to Duke of Wellington.
Well, Ian, we can't look at pictures like that without saying to ourselves, what wonderful nostalgia. Now, what age are we looking at the moment? What's...
That pump was valid from about 1850 onwards. The actual pump we see just now was built in 1898.
And these are steamers, aren't they? Now, that's
Yes.
A steam pump, yes.
A boiler driving a steam engine.
Now, in the old days, obviously they're horse-drawn, as we saw there. Now, the horses had a special harness, didn't they?
Yes, it was hung from the roof of the engine room, and a quick-acting harness. There was only 2 buckles to fasten, and then the horses tuned under the harness. They did this by themselves eventually, and the harness dropped on their backs, 2 buckles, and they were away to the fire.
And the pump itself was kept basically charged up, wasn't it?
Yeah. Yes. We had a small gas jet burning under the boiler, which kept the water warm. As soon as they turned out of the station, they actually got the engineer fired the boiler, and within 7 minutes, I reckon you'd have 100 pounds pressure.
Well, what are these things worth now?
Oh, anything between 5,000 and 10,000 pounds, depending on whether they're working and the conditions of them.
And, I mean, obviously it has uses, you know, in this day and age. I mean, I believe it's been in films, for example.
Oh, yes. It actually belongs to a paper mill in Fife from Tullis Russell. It was used for pumping on the mill there, but it's been in several films and it takes part in rallies.
I think it's perhaps nice to mention that these men who are crewing it are all, in fact, full-time firemen doing this on a voluntary basis.
That's correct, yes.
It's magnificent, isn't it? Still on that act of 1703 I mentioned earlier, it did direct inhabitants of houses to run a rope not only from the street level to the sill of their window, but to allow 4 fathoms, 24 feet to you and me, so that they could tie it round themselves. The mind boggles at Granny swinging to and fro. On the subject of escape and rescue, here's Michael again.
Well, in Britain, now at war, 1941, the Auxiliary Fire Service. What are we looking at here?
Yeah, this is a 50-foot field escape by a London pattern ladder, which was issued to most wartime appliances.
It looks a fairly unwieldy thing, but is it in fact fairly straightforward?
With a trained crew, it's quite straightforward. Some of the later ones had plumbing devices so that it could be pitched on hills.
And we're looking at what there, 3/4 of a ton, half a ton?
About a ton and a half, perhaps, you know. Some were heavier than others, depending on what make they were.
Well, with every fire we have smoke, and this is rather not 1941, this is what, 1920s?
1920s, although they are used today in the Merchant Navy, and in the ship which you've already seen in the yard here, we do still have training on these for Merchant Navy officers.
The theory of that is what, a helmet with a hose?
A helmet with a hose and bellows. If a good chap was on the bellows, you could leave the face mask open because the pressure kept the smoke out.
In a man's career, I mean, when they had these escape ladders, could they go through a whole career and never use it in anger?
Yes, in Edinburgh especially. Not in London because they were regularly used there.
Well, that's about it from this outside broadcast. Our humble and profuse thanks to the Lothian and Borders Fire Brigade for all their cooperation through what's been a very busy day full of fires. Love these helmets, Michael.
But do you know there's a very good reason why these went out of fashion?
Why's that?
Ask Mr. Faraday. It's all about electricity, actually.
Oh, electrocution in that bit.
These conduct electricity.
It's not a current affairs show for nothing. Well, there have been fires all during the day, so Michael... And this...